Okay, are we ready? Oh, maybe not. Oh, yeah, you're... So the second talk is on the Passion according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Just a brief introduction to St. Thomas. He lived in the 13th century. If you think about the 13th century, you have St. Dominic and St. Francis, and St. Clare, and St. Anthony, St. Bonaventure, St. Louis IX, St. Thomas Aquinas, Blessed Jordan of Saxony, St. Albert the Great. I mean, you have just in this one brief century the overlapping of an immense amount of canonized saints. And what makes St. Thomas different than the others isn't that he was holy, because he was and they were. It's that he's probably the only canonized saint who's not only canonized because of his holiness, but because of his thinking. Because almost everything that he wrote, and this is just one volume of the three sections of the Summa, is almost completely adopted by the Church as her own teaching. And no one else, save Augustine, would have that kind of an influence on the Church. And no one else thinks, even Augustine doesn't think as clearly as St. Thomas does. And so I'm a huge fan. I've given the last 3 years of my life to him, so of studying him, and because what we get to see in Aquinas is a beautiful way to present the faith. Now, if you all have never studied Aquinas and you went and picked up the Summa, you might be a little daunted because it's a little bit different way of reading. So what he does, just if you ever do this, if you ever want to pick it up, it's organized in 3 parts. So the first part is God. And so in one simple way to think of this is everything comes from God and everything returns to God. So he starts with who God is and what he isn't. And then he talks about the angels and then the creation and man. And then after he does that, then he goes into man specifically. What does it mean to be a person with intellect and will? And all of the passions, and he deals with that in the second part. And the second part is so huge that there's this first part of the second part and the second part of the second part. And then he gets into Christ. Now, these are not disparate areas. So just because he's not speaking of Christ formally, the person of the incarnation of Jesus Christ in the third part, it doesn't mean he's nothing to do with the rest of the book. That's not the way it works. It's not a linear, if you will. It's not just linear across. And so then he'll go, in the third part, he'll have his treatise on Christ and the mysteries. He calls them mysteries, which are all the things that Christ does on earth. And then the sacraments, and then when he got in the middle of the sacraments, he had a mystical experience where he was taken up to heaven. And when he came back, he said to his secretary, he said, Thomas, it's time to get going. We're almost done with this book, you know. And he said, everything I've written is as straw compared to what I have seen. And he never wrote again. So about the last debatable 6 months to a year of his life, he never didn't complete the Summa. So if you ever open the Summa, the way this works, it's very medieval in one sense, or 13th century scholastic, is he has questions that aren't questions. So for instance, we're doing question 46 out of the second part, out of the third part of the Summa, and it's the Passion of Christ. That's not really a question. That's the subject. But then the next thing are articles, and the articles are questions. So the first article is whether it was necessary for Christ to suffer for the deliverance of the human race. And then what he does is there are objections to each of these things. why this is not the answer. And what he does here is not just that he states what other people think erroneously, but he tends to state it more clear than they do. So when he's taking apart somebody's argument, he can first make their argument better than they can make it. And then he responds with a simple, it's called sed contra, against that, I say, and he gives the answer. And then he has what we call the respondio, where he actually fulfills the whole of the understanding of the answer. So what I would tell you, if you were ever interested in picking it up, is read the article, which is the question. The question is not the question, but the article is the question. And then read the first objection, and that tells you what the answer is not. So for this one, whether it was necessary for the Christ to suffer, it would seem that it was not necessary for Christ to suffer. So you know that's not the answer, because that's the objection. And then stop reading. Drop down to the sed contra, and then read the response. And St. Thomas is the king of making distinctions. So he's rarely just going to say, it's just this and that's the way it is. He's going to help you to think differently. So, in this particular one that we're about to start, whether it was necessary. Well, he says, there's two ways something can be necessary. And in one way, it wasn't necessary. But in another way of understanding necessity, it was. So even though it can be simply, yes, it was, or no, it wasn't, he's going to explain that and make distinctions in the words he's using. We're not going to go into all the fine-tuned things like that today because we don't have time to. But just if you ever do pick him up, which I highly encourage you to do, especially the third part right now. I mean, you can go through and you can read about the mysteries of Christ's life. You know, starting with the incarnation, and then finding in the temple, the baptism. Those are beautiful things to read in the Summa. Okay, so the first question is, was it necessary for Christ to suffer for the deliverance of the human race? And I think when we finish, I hope you'll have a beautiful understanding of how St. Thomas views the Passion. And this first part, this first question that he's asking in the first article, there's, I read that it would seem that it was not necessary. So that means he's going to say it is necessary, but he does make a distinction. Why would he make a distinction? I mean, what would be the danger of saying it was necessary that Christ had to suffer?
Maybe he could have been done a different way.
Well, because he is God, and he is all-powerful. And so it's not necessary in the sense that it could not have been any other way. It could have been a different way, but that's not the way that God willed it. So we'll leave it at that for this first one. That one of the things he does pull out of this is that, in a sense, it's necessary because it has been prophesied that this is what would happen. And he goes through the Old Testament a few places to show that this is what God had said would happen. I wrote a note here, and now I don't remember why I wrote it. Oh, I did want to mention this. This is the third objection, and he says, "It is written, all the ways of the Lord are mercy and truth, but it does not seem necessary that he should suffer on the part of the divine mercy, which, as it bestows gifts freely, so it appears to condone debts without satisfaction, nor again on the part of divine justice, according to which man had deserved everlasting condemnation. Therefore it does not seem necessary that Christ should have to suffer for man's deliverance." So he just did there, he took two things that we put together, mercy and justice, and he said it's not necessary, the objection is it's not necessary by mercy, because why is God, he shouldn't be giving these things for somebody who doesn't get them, who doesn't deserve them, and by justice he should have just condemned us to hell forever. And so his response is, that man should be delivered by Christ's passion was in keeping with both his mercy and his justice. With his justice, because by his passion Christ made satisfaction for the sin of the human race, and so man was set free by Christ's justice. And with his mercy, for since man himself could not satisfy the sin of all human nature, as was said above, God gave his Son to satisfy for him. And so he's united the mercy and the justice of God as part of the expiation of sin. The second question that he asks in this, the second article, was there any other possible way of human deliverance besides the passion of the Christ? What do you think? It's 50-50. So St. Thomas says, depends what you mean by possible. He said simply and absolutely, there could be another way. Because Luke says, nothing will be impossible for God. But he said, there was no other way. Because, why would there be no other way? This is it's a key point to keep in mind in some of these things.
Prophecies and how all the things that were foretold, it'd be hard to conceive of a different pathway that all that would connect up.
So that is not a false statement. But what St. Thomas, he takes it a different route. And he says, because of God's foreknowledge, there could be no other way. So we don't think, when we think, like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And it's impossible for us to understand how everything is now for God. Like, God doesn't change his mind. So it was ordained from before the beginning of the world that this is how it would be. And so in that way, it had to be that way. Was there a more suitable way for it to happen? Anybody?
Does that depend on your definition of suitable?
That is a just question. So in this sense, so when St. Thomas asks a question in this way, whenever he's dealing with something that happened, and especially if it's something that the Lord did, generally the answer is going to be no. No, there's no more suitable way for it to be done if that's the way that the Lord did it. Because you couldn't say, well, if he would have asked me, I would have told him, like, maybe you should do this. And St. Thomas never does that. He says, though, that more than just deliverance is given through the passion. And I think this is great. There are 5 things he says we learn from the passion. First, we know how much God loves us, and we are moved to love him back. Second, Christ sets an example of obedience, humility, constancy, justice, and the other virtues that he showed through the passion. And he references St. Peter's letter. And then he says, not only did he deliver us from sin, but he merited justifying grace for man and the glory of bliss. So it's a little bit of a technical point, but one of the most beautiful things of being a Catholic is that we believe that God justifies us. When we're baptized, we're washed clean of sin, and we're given the life of grace. And then, whenever you do something out of grace, that God crowns his own gifts with other gifts. So he gives you reward for using his grace the way you're supposed to use it. And so, but all of that has its headship in Jesus Christ, the man, who merited everything. All the merits that we receive come from Christ through the passion. Then he says, man is more bound to refrain from sin. Now what he means by that, obviously you can know all about the passion and go right out and sin up a storm, but you shouldn't. Like, you should be moved to see how Christ suffered, to make a decision to try not to sin. And then the 5th, he said, the passion redounds to man's greater dignity. And what he means by that, he said, and this is not unique to Aquinas, this dates back, you can see this in the early church fathers, that man was overcome by the devil, and it is a man who overthrows the devil. Man deserved death, so a man dying vanquishes death. And so by that, it redounds to the great dignity of man. So it would be different if God had sent the angels to figure out how to fix this, but by sending a man, he's teaching how the immense dignity he's given to man, to be made in the image and likeness of God, because even the angels don't have that. In the fourth article, he's going to ask, should Christ have suffered on the cross? Can you think of any objections to this? Like, why would you say he shouldn't have suffered on the cross? Think Old Testament.
Because he was innocent?
Oh, okay. That wasn't what I was thinking of, but sure. What else? What is the Old Testament for the New?
The serpent on the staff, like that prefigured it.
Okay, so not necessarily the serpent, but the prefigurement. Like, why isn't there a this happened and then this happens? So, for instance, what's the example he gives? Oh, yeah. Like the Old Testament, the two animals, the calf and the lamb that were sent out with the people's sins were burned. So why wasn't he burned? Like, they didn't put him on a cross. And so he does the prefigurement. Why isn't it fulfilling the prefigurement in the way that it happens? And then St. John Damascene says that the Christ should not have suffered such a dishonorable death. That's an objection that he raises. I mean, St. Thomas raises. And then also, the dying on the cross is for only the worst of the criminals. And so he shouldn't have done it that way because he wasn't the worst criminal. Those are the objections that he gives. But then he comes back, obviously, and he gives us 7 reasons for why it should have been the cross. The first one echoes what we just heard in the last article, which is that it's an example of virtue. Like, everything that the Lord suffers and all the things he does while suffering are an example to us of his virtue. The second is the atonement for sin. And there we go back to the Old Testament, and we remember that not only was man overcome by the devil, so it was good that man overcomes the devil, but it was also done through a tree. So you can see that also in the writings of, I think, St. Augustine, maybe John Chrysostom. They mention that all of the tools of the fall are all of the tools of the redemption. A man, a virgin, and a tree. And the devil is conquered. He also says, I love this one, he was crucified on the cross so that he could cleanse the very air of the world. Like outside, like the Lord's crucifixion cleanses everything, including the air. By dying on the cross, he prepares for us the ascent into heaven. That's one of my favorite Fulton Sheen lines. There is no Easter Sunday without Good Friday. But there is Easter Sunday after Good Friday. And so the cross is what is preparing us, reminds us that we're being prepared for heaven. He says also, St. Thomas also says, it's befitting the universal salvation of the world. Because of the shape of the cross, with the arms going out, like it shows that it goes all over the world. And that's a little bit from Augustine as well. And then various virtues which we spoke about. Oh, there's a St. Augustine quote that I want to read here for you. Not without purpose did Christ choose the class of death, that he might be a teacher of that breadth and height and length and depth of which the apostle speaks. For breadth is in the beam, which is fixed transversely above. This appertains to good works, since the hands are stretched out upon it. Length is a tree's extent from the beam to the ground, and there it is planted, that is, it stands and abides, which is the note of longanimity. Height is in the portion of the tree which remains over from the transverse beam upwards to the top. And this is at the head of the crucified, because he is the supreme desire of souls of good hope. But the part of the tree which is hidden from view to hold it fixed, and from which the entire root springs, denotes the depths of gratuitous grace. The tree upon which were fixed the members of him dying was even the chair of the master teaching. And that's from St. Augustine. And then the last reason why it should be on the cross is because it is the fulfillment of many of the figures of the Old Testament. The ark, Moses parting the Red Sea with the rod, the same rod changed to the bitter water into sweet water. The battle with Amalek, where Moses' arms are held up and they conquer. All of these figures are fulfilled in the cross. There's one figure in there that's not mentioned that I was surprised by, that St. Thomas doesn't mention this. Can you think who it might be? It's my favorite. It's one of my favorite stories in Genesis. The sacrifice of Isaac. I don't know why he doesn't mention it, because as Isaac's going up with Abraham, and Isaac's not little in this story. You know, you don't strap on wood to a little boy's back and say, "Let's hike up the mountain." But he turns to Abraham and says, "We have everything for the sacrifice, but we don't have a lamb." To which Abraham says, "God himself will provide the lamb." And then the hand is stayed, and there's the lamb that they sacrifice. Okay. The fifth one, this is my absolute favorite. Whether Christ endured all suffering. What do you think? What's the answer? Maeve?
Yes.
Why do you say yes? Okay, who agrees with Maeve? Most people. Why do you withhold?
Because he was fully man, so he couldn't just step out of the moment and get away from it. So he had to fully endure. He wasn't partial.
Okay, so one of the beautiful things about St. Thomas Aquinas is that he's an Aristotelian in a general way. He actually goes beyond Aristotle in many ways, but and so he's just grounded in reality. So his answer is no, he didn't, because it tells us in John's Gospel that the legs of the thieves were broken, but his weren't broken. So he did not endure all suffering. But thanks for playing. So he makes a distinction, as he's wont to do, and he says specifically, Christ didn't suffer everything. Because he didn't. It wasn't necessary for him to endure every single kind of suffering that exists. And it's not possible. Why isn't it possible? Can you think of two ways to suffer that are absolutely not, you just cannot do them at the same time? Versus, okay, that's different. Yeah, you can't compare that to this. Wow, that was a curveball.
Burn and drown.
Burn and drown. That's the answer. Like St. Thomas says, it's just not possible. You can't drown and burn at the same time. One of them's not going to work. So, specifically, no. However, He assumed those defects which flow from the common sin of the whole human nature, yet are not incompatible with the perfection of knowledge and grace. Now that seems like a strange answer, but the end of that is that nothing that he suffered in any way violated the dignity of who he was, in the sense that he always had the knowledge and grace that were part of his nature as the God-man. Generically, he endured every human suffering. And this is just... at the end of this, it's going to rip your heart out, but I'm going to read it to you. It's better for me to read it than to... So he says... Speaking generically, he did endure every human suffering. This admits of a threefold acceptance. First of all, on the part of men. For he endured something from the Gentiles and from the Jews, from men and from women, as is clear from the women servants who accused Peter. He suffered from the rulers, from their servants, and from the mob, according to Psalm 2, verses 1 and 2. Why have the Gentiles raged, and the people devised vain things? The kings of the earth stood up, and the princes met together against the Lord and against his Christ. He suffered from friends and acquaintances, as is manifest from Judas betraying and Peter denying. Secondly, the same is evident on the part of the sufferings which a man can endure. For Christ suffered from friends abandoning him, in his reputation from the blasphemies hurled at him, in his honor and glory from the mockeries and insults heaped upon him, in things, for he was despoiled of his garments, in his soul from sadness, weariness, and fear, in his body from wounds and scourgings. Thirdly, it may be considered with regard to his bodily members. In his head he suffered from the crown of piercing thorns, in his hands and feet from the fastening of the nails, on his face from the blows and the spittle, and from the lashes over his entire body. Moreover, he suffered in all his bodily senses, in touch by being scourged and nailed, in taste by being given vinegar and gall to drink, in smell by being fastened to the gibbet in a place reeking with the stench of corpses, which is called Calvary, in hearing by being tormented with the cries of blasphemers and scorners, and in sight by beholding the tears of his mother and of the disciple whom he loved. This is my absolute favorite part of this whole thing. That last one, to think that the only thing that, the sight, he could have said to see these people rebelling against him, which he would have seen, but it was only to see his mother and her tears. However, in another way, it is written, O all ye that pass by the way, and attend, and see if there any sorrow like unto my sorrow. And so he's going to apply the same distinction he just made before. So in one way, no, it isn't the greatest pain than any other pain, because it would be more painful to be ripped apart or to be roasted over days. However, obviously, because it was Christ, it was the greatest pain. And so what he does he says there's a true and sensible pain in the suffering of Christ. Body and internal pain. And then he goes through all of these different things. So he has sadness. And in this way, bodily and internal pain, in Christ, the sufferings were the greatest. First, because of the sources of his pain. What were the sources of his pain? The wounding of the body. That's an exterior, a sensitive pain. I guess I wanted to read that to you. First of all, For the cause of the sensitive pain was the wounding of his body, and this wounding had its bitterness both from the extent of the suffering already mentioned and from the kind of suffering, since the death of the crucified is most bitter because they are pierced in nervous and highly sensitive parts, to wit, the hands and the feet. Moreover, the weight of the suspended body intensifies the agony, and besides this there is the duration of suffering because they do not die at once like those slain by the sword. The cause of the interior pain was, first of all, the sins of the human race, for which he made satisfaction by suffering. He ascribes them, so to speak, to himself when he says, "The words of my sins," according to the psalm. Secondly, what also pains him interiorly is the fall of the Jews and the others who sinned in his death, chiefly of the apostles who were scandalized at his passion. And thirdly, the loss of his bodily life, which is naturally horrible to human nature. And so these are the interior sufferings of the Lord. I think the one that's interesting, well, they're all interesting in one sense, but the fall of the Jews and the others who were responsible for his death. In a different place, St. Thomas talks about the culpability of the chief priests. And he says that what they did was particularly heinous. He excuses the general Jewish people because they wouldn't have been well versed. You know, they might have been observant, but they wouldn't know the ins and outs of the Old Testament and the prophecies. But for the chief priests particularly and the Pharisees, St. Thomas says that they had willed ignorance. They refused to see who Christ was. And he said because they knew what was in the Old Testament, they should have seen it. And that makes perfect sense if you think about it. You know, when you find out, okay, so he turned water into wine, that's pretty neat. Then some guy who can't see can see. Then some guy who can't walk walks. And then some guy who's dead is living. So he said those miracles should have been like red flashing lights. This guy is something different, and he wasn't. And so that's why St. Thomas points out that would have been a great pain to the Lord to be rejected by his own people. And of course by the apostles who scattered, except for John. And I like that last one on that he's truly man. And none of us looks forward to death. Like it's repugnant to our nature to die. It's not part of our nature to die necessarily. Like our human nature, it's not supposed to die. That's why we have a soul. But the Lord, because of sin, the body dies again, whereas that wasn't original. Okay, and then this last part on this question, then he makes another distinction to help us to just understand the depth of the suffering. Is, so this is a white piece of paper. Let's just pretend that it's all white. And if I take just a little dirt and spread it across there, you'd all be able to see it, right? So when you think of Christ, the All-Holy One, he has an immense capacity to suffer because he's perfect. Whereas we have different things that, because of our fallen nature, there are some different ways that we can't suffer in the same way. Like he willed to suffer in the very depths of every part of his human nature. We can't do that. We can suffer in all sorts of parts of our human nature. We cannot will ourselves to suffer, and he did. And I think I forget which saint it was. I think maybe it's Jose Maria in his Stations, which are my favorite stations. And he says, and being God, how much could he suffer? Not in the sense that God actually suffered, but because of the hypostatic union of God and man, the ability to allow the suffering to go everywhere. To suffer in his passions, in every single part of Christ, as man suffered. And he said, this is from St. John Chrysostom, Just as some other things made by miracles are better than others, as Chrysostom says, respecting the wine into which Christ changed into water at the wedding feast, which he's saying is, there was never a better bottle of wine in the history of mankind than what was made that day in Cana. Consequently, Christ's sense of touch and sensitiveness, of which is the reason for our feeling pain, was most acute. His soul likewise, from its interior powers, apprehended most vehemently all the causes of sadness. So he just, everything that he suffered was to the depths of his being as man. Okay, then he asked, I've got time to do a couple more. He asked, did Christ suffer in his whole soul? So this is an interesting question. So the soul has, so if you will, two parts to it, the upper and the lower. The upper being the reasonable, the will and the intellect, and the lower being our appetites. So what do you think? Did he suffer in his whole soul? This is, again, another 50-50. Anybody? I've made them all nervous after I got you, Maeve. The answer is, in a qualified way, no. And so this is something that not everybody agrees with in Aquinas. I have no problem with it. He says, obviously, in the lower parts of the soul, yes. But there's something that the Lord had that we don't, where it would be impossible for him to suffer in this one little part. What would he have that we don't when he was on earth?
Keeping it down. Keeping it down.
That's a true statement, but that's not what I'm thinking. He had something that we don't have, but we want and hope to have. But he had it from the moment he was conceived. And that's the beatific vision. And so, now, the next question is particularly about that. He says, did he have the beatific vision on the cross? And he says, yes, he did. But by the union of the natures is not a mixing of the natures, but it's a union, and because he is as man, he is united to the eternal second person of the eternal Trinity. He has the beatific vision as man. But it's not allowed by an act of Christ, of the God-man, that it doesn't seep into his body or into all of the soul. Why? What would happen if it was in his body? We just heard that gospel 2 weeks ago. Or 2 weeks ago. Transfiguration. Like he can't have glory in the body or nobody can see him. Like the apostles would have been dropping dead. And so by a singular act that he makes, he has the beatific vision, but it does not overcome everything else he is as man. And St. Thomas thinks this is important to remind us that he's still God. And that the gifts he has as man are already there. So you said he has no doubt. He also has no faith. And he has no hope because he doesn't need them. There's no time from the moment of the conception to the ascension that Christ is wondering what's coming next. Because he does know. And he does have the beatific vision. And so this is why St. Thomas is so big on this, because if he doesn't have the beatific vision, then he has to have faith. And how can God have faith? So there are lots of people who dispute this. I'm just not one of them. So, okay, just to end real quickly, there's only 3 more articles, but he asks somewhat simple questions. I'm just going to give you the answer, but I do encourage you to read these if you have time, because it's a beautiful reflection. Did he suffer at a suitable time? And so St. Thomas makes objections about, was it the right time in history? Was it the right time of day? Was it the right time of year? And was it the right time in his life? And of course, because that's the way it happened, then it was. But there's a beautiful reflection where he goes through, especially, I think he's answering it's the respondio, and he just goes through the different things, and so if you've read these things in the Gospels, you'll know that there's maybe a little bit of difference, and he works through to help you understand why Matthew says this, and John that, and Luke this. So I'd encourage you to read that. And then in the next article, he says, was it a suitable place? And so for place, he's going to object, was it the right city? Was it the right place? Why wasn't it in the temple? And should it be where Adam was buried? And so the answer, the reason it had to be Jerusalem is that's where the sacrifice took place. I mean, not just that's where Christ was crucified, but that's where the sacrifices took place, was in Jerusalem. The reason it wasn't in the temple is because it's not limited to just this little group of people. It's universal. And the reason that it wasn't where Adam was buried this is sort of a strange response. It was in keeping with his humility that he suffered in a well-known place. So it wasn't like he was like where Adam was buried was kind of out in the middle of nowhere, I guess. I don't know where Hebron is actually, but Jerusalem was well known. And the reason Jerusalem is important is because it's the center of the inhabitable world, as known at that time. And so it was the meeting point, really, of East and West. And so that was why Jerusalem was so important. And then the next one, was it fitting for him to be crucified with thieves? Why was he crucified with thieves in the first place?
They were criminals.
Right. The idea was he'll look more guilty if he's with guilty people. That was the idea behind it. But so I love this. He says there are two intentions for Christ being crucified with thieves. One on the part of the Jews, which is to make him look more guilty. But the other is God's attention as the guilty among the guilty. So he's quoting St. Paul. So that he made himself like sin so that we might be forgiven our sins. And then the last question in this, and there are a few other questions that deal with this, is Christ's passion attributed to his Godhead? What does that mean? If you think of passion, of course, means suffering. Can you attribute that to the Godhead? Why or why not? Katie, what do you think? Okay, you're on the right road with no, and linking it back but in a different way. Here St. Thomas is speaking, he's thinking metaphysically, which means when we talk about God and we say he's all-knowing, he's all-loving, he's all-merciful, he's all-just, he's all-powerful, that's all true. He's not half-knowing, half-just, half-merciful. Whatever God is, he is. And so it's metaphysically impossible for God to be all-suffering. So on the part of the Godhead, God did not suffer. Now, the natures are there. They're not separate. But we cannot say properly that God suffered on the cross. In one sense. We can say it in a qualified sense that we understand that it's Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God, who became man and was crucified. He suffered. But God the Trinity did not suffer. The second person of the Blessed Trinity, as God, did not suffer. Because that's not possible. Otherwise God would be all suffering. And that's not possible. So it's really an important point, maybe not for everyday reflection in one sense, but there's some popular I wouldn't even say popular, but there is one theologian who's somewhat popular, not necessarily today, but he wrote about how everything that Jesus went through on the cross is present in the Trinity. And as a Thomist, you just have to reject that out of hand, because there's no suffering in the Trinity. Because he's all good, all powerful. And really, the metaphysical point is, to suffer is to receive something, even though we think of it as bad, and it is in that sense, but God receives nothing. He's not sufficient, he's not deficient in any way. So there's no room for him to receive something, because he has everything. So there's no ability for him to suffer as God. Does that make sense? So the other things he deals with, just briefly right after that, is he'll go through the burial, the death, the burial, and the descent into hell. So those, I don't have enough time to do all those things, but I hope it's been helpful, and maybe that'll give you something to pray about at adoration, and coupled with the things you were watching with Dr. Ted Sri. One of the highlights of my life was 2 years ago. I got to spend the Holy Week in the Holy Land. And so, and this, I don't know how just this is, but if you're a priest, you get into everything. As long as you're dressed like I am, and you have a surplice or an alb, depending on the day, So when you were seeing that couple reverence the cross or the crucifixion altar, so I was probably from me to you away from that altar on Good Friday 2 years ago, and then I was at the tomb for Holy Saturday, which was at 8 in the morning, but it's okay, it still worked. So it was a wonderful thing. So, well, thank you for your attention, and I guess we'll go down to the church. We have adoration, I'll have exposition, and then if you give me just a few minutes, and then we'll have confessions too, and then we'll finish with benediction.
So don't forget to go pick up your kids. And the